My son looked me straight in the eyes and shouted, "You've ruined everything." His voice cracked like thunder in my chest, and at 70 years old, I felt those words cutting deeper than any knife ever could. I was standing in the kitchen I had remodeled with my own 2 hands, surrounded by bills and scattered receipts, while Marcus's fiancée Olivia leaned back in her chair with a sly little smile. The kind of smile a person wears when they know the damage has already been done. I remember clutching the edge of the table so hard that my knuckles turned white, because if I let go, I feared I would crumble right there on the cold linoleum floor. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains in faded streaks, painting everything in that dull orange of a day that had already gone wrong. Marcus stood there, 29 years old, tall and restless, his finger trembling as he pointed at me as if I were the enemy. "You never supported me. You never believed in me," he said, his words dripping with resentment I couldn't recognize as my own son's voice. Olivia nodded softly, her manicured nails tapping against the table like a judge marking down a verdict. For a moment, silence stretched heavy in the room, only broken by the faint hum of the refrigerator and my own shallow breathing. I had given that boy everything. 30 years working as a school janitor, mopping endless hallways before sunrise, scrubbing chalk dust off blackboards long after everyone else had gone home. Every blister on my hands had been a brick in the life I tried to build for him. But standing there in my kitchen, it was as if none of that mattered. The words pouring out of his mouth weren't just anger. They were a declaration that my sacrifices were invisible. Something strange happened inside me then. Instead of collapsing into tears, a quiet coldness spread through me, like a river freezing solid in the dead of winter. My heartbeat slowed, my breathing steadied, and I realized I was done pleading for gratitude, done begging to be seen. Olivia tilted her head and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "She'll never understand, Marcus. She's stuck in her old ways." The words were dipped in poison, and yet she delivered them with the softness of honey. I gripped the keys in my pocket so tight that the edges pressed into my skin, grounding me in a way that no apology from them ever could. My son's face twisted with frustration, but I stayed silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching me break. For the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking about what they wanted. I was thinking about what I needed. That night, as the house settled into its usual creaks and sighs, I sat in my armchair by the window, staring out at the magnolia tree I had planted when Marcus was 5 years old. I thought about how its branches had grown strong despite storms, how it had survived seasons of drought and floods, and I whispered to myself, if that tree can survive, so can I. The next morning, before dawn, I slipped into my navy coat, the one I saved for Sundays, and walked through the quiet streets toward the credit union. The sidewalks still glistened with dew, and the city hadn't yet woken up to its rush of car horns and hurried footsteps. For once, I didn't feel like a shadow moving through life. I felt like a woman reclaiming her breath. At the teller's window, I asked to freeze every extra account I had ever opened for Marcus. The young woman behind the glass blinked in surprise, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Are you sure, Mrs. Johnson? Some of these have recurring payments linked to them." My voice came out steady, stronger than I remembered it being in years. "Yes, I'm sure. Cancel them all." The authority in my tones startled even me, as though another version of myself, the one I had buried beneath years of sacrifice, was finally stepping into the light. When I walked back home, the sun rose over the rooftops, brushing my face with a warmth I hadn't felt in decades. It was like breathing for the first time after being underwater too long. Each step echoed a truth. I was no longer a vessel for someone else's dreams. I was a woman with her own life to protect. 2 weeks before Marcus's explosion in my kitchen, everything had seemed so deceptively peaceful. He had arrived one Saturday morning with a wide smile stretched across his face, carrying boxes of pastries from a trendy cafe uptown. The pastries were stacked neatly in a box tied with ribbon, the kind of expensive treat I had never allowed myself to buy. Not even once, even after decades of saving pennies in coffee cans. "For you, Mama," he said, kissing my cheek. His lips were warm, but his smile did not reach his eyes. Olivia followed soon after, sweeping into the house like she owned the place already, carrying a bouquet of lilies so perfect they looked like they had been painted rather than grown. She placed them in the center of my worn oak table without asking, rearranging the room as if testing how much of my life she could already claim. "Mama, I have amazing news," Marcus said, pulling out a chair and sitting with an ease that made me feel like a guest in my own home. His hand reached for Olivia's, and she held it delicately, showing off the oversized diamond ring that caught the morning light. "I asked her to marry me, and she said yes." His words should have filled me with joy, but something inside me tightened. Olivia leaned across the table, her perfume heavy, her smile too deliberate. "You raised such a strong man," she said sweetly, though her eyes were already darting across the shelves where I kept family heirlooms. Pausing on the antique clock that had belonged to my grandmother, I saw her measuring it, weighing it, not in sentiment, but in value. Before I could respond, Marcus added, "We want the kind of wedding you never had, something grand, something unforgettable." That sentence clung to me like a thorn. It was true, my own wedding had been modest, a simple ceremony at the church followed by cornbread and stew in the fellowship hall. Nothing extravagant, but it had been real, pure, filled with love. Now, hearing my son compare my simplicity to the grand spectacle he envisioned, I realized he wasn't only announcing joy, he was planting seeds of guilt, seeds Olivia would soon water with careful words. They pulled out their phones, sliding images across the screen of grand venues. Sparkling chandeliers, glossy tables set for hundreds of strangers. "This one holds 300 guests," Olivia explained, her voice rich with enthusiasm. "It has a glass dance floor, a champagne fountain, and imported orchids flown in from Asia." Her words rolled out like rehearsed lines in a performance, and Marcus nodded in rhythm with each one, as though he had been coached. "Mama, you'll finally have something to brag about," he added, a grin pulling across his face. The numbers flashing across those screens made my stomach knot. I whispered, "That must cost a fortune," but my words were swallowed by their chatter, dismissed as background noise. Olivia glanced at Marcus, and I caught that flicker of unspoken understanding between them. The same kind of look to gamblers exchange when they know the dice are loaded in their favor. By the next week, Olivia returned with a folder, polished and heavy, filled with contracts and printed estimates. She spread them across my dining room table, the same table where Marcus had once learned to read under the glow of a single lamp. "These just need a signature," she said smoothly. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, locked on me like a hawk circling its prey. I looked down at the numbers: caterers demanding sums I couldn't imagine. Photographers charging fees larger than the down payment on my home had been 30 years ago. Florists asking for more than my monthly pension just to fill the tables with flowers that would wilt in hours. "Don't you think this is too much?" I asked carefully, tapping a finger against the line for designer linens. The cost alone was equal to 3 months of groceries. Marcus sighed, a sound filled with irritation, instead of patience. "Mama, it's my only wedding. Don't you want me to be happy?" The words landed like stones in my chest. Olivia touched my arm lightly, a false tenderness coating her voice. "You deserve this too, Mrs. Johnson. After all your sacrifices, why not have a wedding in the family that people will remember forever?" And like a fool clinging to the fantasy that love and sacrifice might still mean something, I nodded. "Of course," I said, the words leaving my mouth as if pulled by invisible strings. Their smiles grew wide, almost triumphant, and Olivia's eyes sparkled, not with gratitude, but with victory. In that moment, I didn't see the trap closing, only the illusion of being a good mother. Days later, I found myself signing checks I couldn't afford, handing over years of careful savings to pay for bands, venues, gowns, and photographs that didn't belong to me. I convinced myself it was love, but deep down I felt the faint, bitter taste of being used. Still, I stayed silent. Still, I believed. It was a Thursday afternoon when the illusion finally cracked. Marcus had left his jacket tossed carelessly over my sofa, and as he stepped outside to take a call, his phone lit up on the armrest. I did not mean to read it, but the screen glowed bright with a new message. and the words burned into me before I could turn away. "Don't worry, baby. She's paying for everything. Once the wedding's over, we'll work on getting the house too." The message was from Olivia. My chest tightened, and my hands began to tremble. I read it again and again, hoping my eyes had tricked me, but the letters never changed. I was the house, the money, not a mother, not a woman, not flesh and blood, just a stepping stone in their plan. When Marcus returned, his face glowed with satisfaction, his voice casual as he spoke into his phone about deposits and deadlines. I forced myself to smile, forced myself to nod when Olivia mentioned another vendor, another contract, another signature. But inside, a quiet war began. I felt the heavy weight of betrayal pressing into my ribs, squeezing the air from my lungs, yet I sat there like a statue, giving them no hint of the storm rising within me. That night, alone in my bedroom, I pulled out the shoebox where I kept copies of every check, every receipt. I laid them out across my quilt, like a funeral shroud. The numbers stared back at me with merciless clarity. I had given away nearly all of my savings, years of hard work that had kept me afloat when times were lean. All of it had been siphoned into a celebration that wasn't mine, a dream that belonged to two people who looked at me not with love, but with calculation. The tears finally came, hot and unrelenting, but beneath them was something sharper, something harder. It was the slow birth of resolve. In the days that followed, Olivia's presence became constant. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets, commented on my outdated furniture, suggested I consider moving into a smaller apartment more appropriate for a woman my age. She said it with such false kindness that anyone listening would think she cared about my well-being. But I could see the gleam in her eyes each time she mentioned my house. The house I had worked 3 decades to pay off. The house where my memories lived in every brick and corner. "My sanctuary, Mama," Marcus said one evening, avoiding my eyes as he shuffled papers on the table. "Olivia and I have been thinking. Maybe it would be easier if you added me to your accounts. Just for emergencies." His voice was casual, but his hands fidgeted. And Olivia's gaze locked on me like a predator waiting for its prey to stumble. My throat tightened. At 70 years old, I had managed my finances alone, through recessions, sickness, and storms. Now my son wanted me to hand over the keys to my survival. "I can handle my own money," I replied firmly, sharper than I intended. Marcus looked startled. Olivia's smile faltered for the briefest second before she masked it with sweetness. "Of course, Mrs. Johnson," she said quickly. "We only meant it would be safer, easier." But I had seen her eyes. I had heard her words on that phone screen. And I knew safety was never her concern. It all came to a boiling point when I walked into my kitchen late one night and found Marcus rifling through my drawers. He straightened up quickly, a sheepish grin plastered across his face. "Just looking for some paper, Mama," he said. But tucked under his arm, I glimpsed the folder where I kept my property deed and insurance papers. My heart sank, and for the first time in my life, I felt fear in my own home. I went back to my bedroom, shut the door, and pressed my back against it as if that flimsy piece of wood could protect me from the truth. My own son, my only child, was conspiring to strip me of the life I had built, and I had invited it in with open arms. But as I sat there in the dark, clutching the old Bible my mother had left me, I whispered, "Not anymore." The words shook, but they were mine. They were the first bricks in the wall I would build to protect myself. The following morning, I picked up the phone and dialed the number of an old friend who had once been my lawyer when I purchased the house. My hands trembled as I spoke, but my voice carried a steadiness that surprised me. "Mr. Whitaker, this is Evelyn Johnson. I need to see you. It's urgent. It's about my property and my accounts." He didn't hesitate. "Bring everything you have, Mrs. Johnson. I'll clear my schedule." For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me, not weakness, not fear, but the stirring of power I thought I had lost forever. The next morning, I tucked every important paper into a faded leather folder. The deed to my house, bank statements, copies of checks, even the insurance policies I had stored away for decades. As I zipped the folder shut, my heart pounded. Not with fear this time, but with determination. I slipped on my old brown coat and headed toward Mr. Whitaker's office downtown. The city was just beginning to stir, buses grumbling at corners, storekeepers unlocking their doors, the air sharp with the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. Each step I took felt like a declaration, a reminder that I was not helpless, that I still had the power to protect myself. When I entered his office, Mr. Whitaker looked much older than I remembered. His hair now white, his glasses perched low on his nose. But his eyes carried the same warmth they had 20 years ago when he guided me through the purchase of my home. "Mrs. Johnson," he said kindly, standing to shake my hand, "tell me what's happening." For the first time in weeks, I felt safe enough to let the words tumble out. I told him everything: the extravagant wedding plans, the endless contracts, the checks I had signed without thinking, Olivia's manipulations, and Marcus's request to be added to my accounts. I even admitted to seeing that message on his phone, the one that had confirmed what my instincts already screamed: they were after my house. My voice cracked more than once, but Mr. Whitaker listened patiently, never interrupting, only nodding with understanding. When I was finished, the silence in the room was heavy. "Mrs. Johnson," he said finally, his tone firm but gentle, "you are experiencing what we call financial abuse. It often happens within families, and it's more common than most people realize. But you are not powerless. We can secure your assets, block any further attempts to drain your accounts, and make sure your property remains solely under your name." His words washed over me like cool water on a burn. I was not imagining things. I was not just being dramatic. I was a victim, yes, but also a survivor who had finally chosen to fight back. We spent hours going through every document. He pointed out clauses hidden in the contracts, traps designed to keep me tied to payments long after the wedding was over. He helped me draft letters to cancel services I had been tricked into booking, and then he filed the paperwork that would make it impossible for anyone, even my own son, to access my accounts without my explicit consent. When I left his office, clutching that folder, I felt taller somehow, straighter, like the weight on my back had been lifted just enough for me to breathe again. As I walked home, the autumn wind whipped around me, crisp and fierce, and I welcomed it. The streets seemed brighter, the people less threatening, the world less suffocating. By the time I reached my front steps, I felt armored, as if every brick in that house was standing guard with me. But peace did not last long. When I stepped inside, I found Marcus and Olivia sitting in my living room, papers scattered across the coffee table. Their voices hushed quickly when they saw me. Olivia plastered on her sweetest smile, but her eyes darted to the folder in my arms. "Perfect timing, Mrs. Johnson," she said cheerfully. "We've found the florist of our dreams, and they need a deposit today. Only $15,000. She said it as though she were asking for bus fare. Marcus leaned forward, his tone urgent. "Mama, we can't miss this opportunity. It's now or never." I sat my folder down calmly, my fingers tracing the leather edges. 15,000. I asked quietly. "Do you know what that is?" "That's nearly a year of my pension. Flowers that will wilt in a week are not worth my future." Their smiles froze. Olivia blinked, her mask slipping for just a second before she tried again. "But Mrs. Johnson, this is for Marcus's happiness, for your family's legacy." I held up my hand. "Enough." My voice was firm, stronger than I had expected. "My money is mine. My house is mine, and I will not sign another paper, not for flowers, not for bands, not for anything." The room went silent. Marcus stared at me as though he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Olivia's lips tightened, the sweetness draining from her face. For the first time, I saw their plan falter, saw the cracks in their performance, and for the first time in a long while, I felt unafraid. Marcus looked at me as if a stranger had slipped into my skin, his mouth opening and closing while he searched for the old version of Mitha, one who signed checks without question, who apologized for taking up space in her own house. Olivia recovered first. She crossed her legs, folded her hands with that courtroom calm of hers, and said, almost sweetly, that I must be overwhelmed and confused, that women my age often struggled with big decisions, that perhaps a doctor should evaluate my stress before I did anything I might regret. I felt the insult brush my cheek like a slap, but I did not flinch. I picked up the folder, slid it beneath my arm, and told them both that from this day forward nothing in my name would be promised, purchased, or pledged without my written approval, and that the era of emergency signatures and rushed deposits had ended. Marcus's voice rose, pleading then accusing, skittering from sorrow to rage, as if changing masks could bend my spine back into its old shape. He tried the soft memories. Remember when you used to sing me to sleep? Remember when you kept the lights on even when your feet ached, and when those didn't open my purse? He reached for thunder. He said I was selfish, that I was sabotaging his future, that any decent mother would move heaven and earth to give her child a day to remember. I told him memory without respect is just noise dressed in silk, and no silk would be bought on my dime again. When they left, the house exhaled. And so did I. I gathered every spare key and every garage opener they had collected for convenience, and tucked them into a tin beneath my bed. I changed the passcode on the Wi-Fi, set new passwords on my bank accounts, called the utility companies and added verbal pins so no one could sweet-talk their way into my information. I pulled the small fireproof box from the back of the closet and placed inside it the deed, my will, the insurance forms, and the letter Mr. Whitaker drafted confirming that my accounts required two-step authentication and could not be altered by anyone but me. Then I brewed tea and sat by the window, watching the magnolia leaves stir, telling myself that safety often arrives quiet, like dawn, not like a parade. The next days were a study in tactics. Olivia sent long messages dripping with concern, explaining that vendors needed answers, and that delays would harm Marcus's reputation, as if the city would crumble if a stranger didn't get orchids flown across an ocean. Marcus arrived with takeout he knew I liked, boxed neatly, warm as guilt. He called me Ma like he did when he was little, and for a sliver of a moment, I saw the boy who cried when bees startled him at the park. The boy who wrapped his arms around my neck after nightmares. The boy I worked overtime for until my knees throbbed. But then he said I was jeopardizing contracts, and the spell broke. I told him supper was welcome, pressure was not, and that if he wanted to share a meal, he could sit and eat as my son, not as Olivia's messenger. He pushed his chair back so hard it scraped the floor, said I was impossible, that everyone knew I was stubborn, that Olivia's family thought I was ungrateful. I said strangers' opinions do not pay my bills, and opinions will not live in this house rent-free. I set new rules for myself, small shields that add up to armor. No discussions about money, unless I initiate them, in daylight, with my notebook open. No papers on my table, unless Mr. Whitaker has read them first. No visits without a call, and no calls answered when voices are raised. I wrote these rules on a card and taped it inside the pantry door, where I reach every morning for coffee. On Sunday, I walked to church and slipped into the back pew, the choir warming the sanctuary like sunlight under winter glass. After service, a woman from the seniors group pressed my hand and said she had once been where I was, that a niece had drained her savings with stories about investments and opportunities, that reclaiming herself felt like dragging a net out of deep water, hand over hand, blister by blister, but the shore had been there all along. I carried her words home like a lantern. On Monday, I called the credit union again and asked them to issue a new card with a lower limit. Not because I doubted my strength, but because I respect my triggers. I moved a portion of my savings to a certificate I couldn't touch without a waiting period. I made an appointment at the locksmith's and had the front door reached while he worked. I told him I'd misplaced a spare and wanted to be safer. He nodded. No questions, no judgment, just the steady click of a trade that turns uncertainty into metal. That evening, I opened the window and let the breeze lift the kitchen curtains the way it did when Marcus was small and summer smelled like cut grass and popsicles. I whispered to the room that I would not apologize for guarding the life I built. And when my phone lit up with another message from Oliviano, a paragraph longer, now warning about non-refundable commitments, I turned the screen face down and let silence be my answer. The days rolled on, and with them came a new rhythm inside my home, one where silence was no longer loneliness but a shield, a melody that soothed rather than stung. Marcus's calls came less often now, shorter, clipped, like he didn't know how to speak to a mother who no longer bent under his requests. Olivia's words grew sharper, too, hidden beneath politeness but edged like glass. She would ask how I was feeling, then slip in a remark about how fragile older women could become. How easily they could be taken advantage of by institutions if they weren't careful. It was her way of suggesting that Marcus was my salvation, not my predator. I recognized the game for what it was, and for once, I didn't swallow the bait. One evening, Marcus appeared unannounced at my door. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the living room like he was taking inventory again. He sat on the sofa with a sigh and folded his hands together, a posture I knew from his boyhood meant he was rehearsing. "Mama," he began, his voice almost tender, "Olivia and I are under a lot of pressure. Vendors are calling every day, contracts need to be signed, deposits have to be made. We can't do this without you." I looked at him steadily, waiting for the words that would follow, the words I already knew were coming. "If you could just sign over temporary access to the house papers, maybe add Olivia to one of your accounts, it would make things smoother." I felt something inside me settle, a strange calm like the stillness before rain. "Marcus," I said slowly, "this house is not yours to promise. My accounts are not yours to manage. If you and Olivia want a grand wedding, you'll have to find another way to pay for it." His face darkened. The tenderness evaporated, replaced by a sharp edge I had only seen glimpses of before. "So that's it. After everything you've preached about family, you're just going to abandon me when I need you most." The words echoed in the room, but they no longer cut me. They were old tricks, sharpened by guilt and dressed in desperation. I told him I wasn't abandoning him, I was protecting myself. That there's a difference between helping and being consumed. He shook his head, muttering about ungrateful mothers, about sacrifices wasted, about how Olivia deserved better than this humiliation. Then he stood, storming out the door, the slam rattling the frame like thunder. That night, I sat in my armchair with the magnolia tree swaying outside, thinking of the decades I had poured into raising a son who now saw me as a wallet instead of a woman. But I also thought of my grandmother, who once told me that dignity isn't inherited. It's claimed, and that sometimes claiming it means losing those who mistake love for ownership. Her words, long buried, rose inside me like a hymn. The next morning, Olivia herself arrived, her smile brittle, her voice syrupy. She carried a garment bag and laid it carefully on the sofa, unzipping it to reveal a wedding gown dripping with lace and pearls. "Isn't it stunning?" she whispered, holding it against her frame. When I tried it on, even the seamstress cried. "Marcus says it's perfect. We just need you to pay the deposit to make sure no one else takes it." She paused, watching me, waiting for the automatic nod, the surrender she had grown used to, but I did not nod. I rose from my chair slowly, looked her square in the eye, and said, "That dress is beautiful, but beauty built on manipulation turns to dust. I will not pay for it." Her smile cracked. For a moment, I saw the mask slip, the annoyance, the anger, the disbelief that her charm had failed. Then she zipped the bag with jerky hands, muttering that she had never met someone so heartless. She left without another word, and the house grew still again, not with defeat, but with triumph. Later that evening, I called Mr. Whitaker and updated him on what had happened. He listened carefully, then told me, "You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Johnson. Remember, boundaries don't make you cruel. They make you free." His words sank deep, and I repeated them aloud after I hung up, letting them echo through the house like a prayer. I began writing in a journal, something I hadn't done since Marcus was a child. Each night, I poured onto the page what I had felt, what had been said, what I had resisted. The journal became a mirror, showing me my strength growing day by day. And with each entry, I felt less like prey and more like the woman I once had been, the one who worked double shifts, who planted magnolias in the yard, who built a home brick by brick without anyone's help. The days after Olivia's visit were quiet. but it was the kind of quiet that hides storm clouds just beyond the horizon. I knew they weren't finished. People who taste control rarely surrender it willingly. I prepared myself the way a soldier might tidying papers, double-checking locks, rehearsing in my mind the words I would speak if pressed again. Every morning, I rose early, brewed my coffee, and reminded myself, my life is mine, my house is mine, my voice is mine. Then, on a gray Wednesday afternoon, Marcus returned, this time alone. He looked weary, dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders drooping as though the weight of Olivia's expectations pressed down harder than he could bear. For a fleeting moment, the mother in me wanted to reach out, to smooth his brow, to tell him I would fix everything like I used to when he scraped his knees. But I stopped myself. Love without boundaries had already cost me too much. He sat at the table without asking and began to talk, his voice softer than before, almost pleading. Mama, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. Olivia's family expects a certain kind of wedding. They think less of me if I can't provide it. I need you to help me save face. His eyes glistened, not with genuine sorrow, but with the practiced wetness of someone who knows tears can be currency. I listened, my hands folded in my lap, and when he finished, I spoke as calmly as I could. Marcus, your worth as a man is not measured by chandeliers or banquet halls. If Olivia or her family believes otherwise, that is their problem, not mine. I will not fund illusions. His face hardened. He called me selfish again, said I was cruel, said I was choosing pride over love. But this time, his words didn't stick to me. They fell like raindrops on stone. I told him that love does not mean bankrupting yourself to prove loyalty, that a wedding built on debt and deceit will never blossom into a marriage worth keeping. He rose from the table, fists clenched, muttering that he didn't know me anymore. I whispered, maybe it's time you learn who I really am. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat with my journal. I wrote down every word, every gesture, every flicker of anger in his eyes, because I knew clarity is built brick by brick, and memory is sharper on paper than in the fog of guilt. The flame flickered, and I thought of my grandmother again. How she used to say that fire burns what no longer belongs in the house. I stared at that candle and imagined it consuming all the false promises, all the manipulations, all the contracts I had torn apart. 2 days later, Olivia returned, this time with her mother in tow. A tall woman with stiff posture and a polished smile. She wasted no time before speaking. Mrs. Johnson, she said, her voice smooth but cold. I understand there's been some hesitation about supporting Marcus and Olivia's future. In our family, we consider weddings a collective responsibility. Everyone contributes. Surely you don't want to be the reason this union begins with shame. I stood straight, meeting her gaze without trembling. With respect, I said, your family may have its traditions, but in my house, I do not sign away my stability to fund anyone's image. Marcus and Olivia are free to marry, free to celebrate however they please, but not at the cost of my roof, my savings, or my peace. Her smile faltered, replaced by a glare that told me she was unused to resistance. Olivia muttered under her breath, her hands tightening around the garment bag she carried. Together, they left, the front door closing behind them like the final notes of a symphony I refused to attend. After they were gone, I felt the house breathe again, lighter, freer. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the pictures. I reminded myself this was not just a building. It was my story carved into wood and stone. Every corner whispered resilience. Every creak in the floorboard hummed of survival. I promised myself that no matter what storms came next, this house would not fall, not to manipulation, not to greed, not to betrayal disguised as love. That evening, I called Mr. Whitaker once more. He listened as I described the latest confrontation and assured me that legally, my fortress was sealed. They can huff and they can threaten, he said, but without your consent, they cannot touch what you own. His words were a balm, and I slept that night with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. The storm outside could rage all it wanted inside my walls. I had found peace. The following week, I began to notice something different in myself. The fear that had once knotted my stomach every time the phone rang was gone. When Marcus's name flashed on the screen, I no longer felt the urge to answer immediately, as though his voice held dominion over my days. Instead, I let it ring, the sound fading into the air like a song I no longer wanted to hear. The silence afterward was not empty, it was full, rich with the sound of my own freedom. But silence did not mean the battle was over. Marcus arrived again, this time with his voice lowered, his anger replaced with a new weapon: shame. "Mama," he said quietly, "people are talking. Olivia's friends think you don't care about us. They say it's embarrassing that my own mother won't support me. Do you want them to think you're cold? Do you want them to think I come from nothing?" His words were heavy, deliberate, designed to bruise. I sat across from him, folding laundry slowly, not looking up until he finished. "Marcus," I said, "I raised you from nothing, and I gave you everything I had. If others do not see that, then they are blind, and if you do not see it, then you are lost." His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and he muttered that I was impossible, that no conversation could reach me anymore. But what he didn't understand was that conversation no longer meant surrender for me. It meant clarity, and I had more of it than I ever dreamed possible. Later that night, Olivia sent an email. Not a message, not a call, an email, as though this were some business transaction she could close with the right phrasing. It was long, filled with phrases like once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and once you're gone, Marcus will have nothing left. She dared to remind me of my age, to plant seeds of mortality like weeds in fertile soil. I read it once, twice, then pressed delete. Her words vanished from the screen, and with them, the power she thought they carried. The days after that were a blessing. I cooked for myself again, not for company or obligation, but for joy. I sat on the porch with tea and listened to the world hum by. I joined the seniors group from church for bingo night, laughing louder than I had in years, remembering what it felt like to be surrounded by people who didn't want anything from me except my presence. One woman leaned close and whispered, "Evelyn, you've got a light in your eyes again." I touched my cheek and realized she was right, I did. But storms test the strongest walls, and mine was tested one final time. On a Sunday afternoon, Marcus returned, this time angrier than I had ever seen him. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open, his voice already rising. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," he shouted. "Do you know what people are saying? Do you know how hard Olivia and I have worked to plan this wedding?" His words filled the house, bouncing off the walls like fists. I stood in the doorway of the living room, calm as still water, and told him he needed to leave. He froze, shocked. "Leave? This is my home too." He barked. My heart clenched, but my voice did not waver. "No, Marcus. This is my home. I built it. I paid for it. And no one, not even my son, has the right to claim it without my consent." He stared at me, rage and disbelief mixing on his face. For a long moment he didn't move, and the silence was heavy. Then, with a muttered curse, he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I sank into my armchair, my breath shaking, but my spirit steady. I realized then that the battle was never just about money or a house. It was about dignity, about refusing to be erased in the final chapters of my life. I was 70 years old, yes, but I was not finished. My voice still mattered. My choices still mattered. My life was still mine. That evening, I opened my journal and wrote one sentence in bold letters. "I am not a bank. I am not a doormat. I am a woman who survived and will keep surviving." I underlined it twice, closed the book, and let the truth rest beside me like a trusted friend. The week that followed was the calm after the storm. Though calm does not always mean quiet, my phone still buzzed with Marcus's number, and Olivia's messages still tried to seep through like water under a door. But my responses had become silence, and silence, I realized, was not weakness, it was armor. I learned to let their words die in the void I created, a void that protected me more than any lock ever could. One morning, as I watered the magnolia tree, I thought back to the years I had spent pouring myself into others. Double shifts at the school, ironing uniforms, pinching pennies so Marcus could have new shoes when all I wore were patched slippers. I remembered the pride in my heart each time he achieved something, small or great, and how I thought those achievements were mine too. Now I saw the truth. They had been his, and I had allowed myself to disappear behind them, but not anymore. That tree grew because I planted it, because I cared for it. And like the magnolia, I was allowed to flourish in my own right, not as an accessory to anyone else's story. I began to fill my days with things I had once postponed for someday. I baked sweet potato pies and carried slices to neighbors. I joined a quilting circle at church and let my hands sew stories into fabric, stories of resilience, of laughter, of scars that healed. I visited the library and checked out books I had always meant to read, losing myself in other people's tales instead of being trapped in my own grief. Each act was small, but together they built a life that was mine again. Marcus appeared once more, a week later, standing on the porch with eyes that looked less furious, more lost. He knocked softly, something he hadn't done in months. I opened the door but did not invite him in. He shifted on his feet, his shoulders slumping. "Mama," he said quietly, "I don't understand you anymore. You used to give me everything." I met his gaze and answered, "I used to give you everything because I thought that's what love meant. But love is not destroying yourself so someone else can thrive. Love is teaching someone to stand on their own feet. I gave you more than enough. Now it's time you give yourself what you need." His lips pressed together, his eyes glassy as though tears might come, but he turned before they could fall. He walked away, slower this time, not with anger, but with something heavier, perhaps shame, perhaps realization. When he disappeared down the street, I closed the door, leaning against it for a moment. I knew this wasn't the end of our story, but I also knew it was the end of their control over me. If reconciliation was to come, it would not come through manipulation or money, it would come through truth, or not at all. That evening, I lit another candle, the flame dancing softly in the dark. I whispered prayers for Marcus, for Olivia, even for myself. Not prayers for their wedding or their image, but prayers for clarity, for strength, for healing where bitterness had taken root. I prayed that one day Marcus would remember the mother who sang him to sleep, not the bank he tried to rob. Then I turned on the radio, let the music fill the house, and danced slowly in the living room. My knees ached, my back complained, but I danced anyway. Because freedom deserves a celebration, even if the only guest is yourself. The weeks turned into months, and my house began to feel alive again. No longer a stage for manipulations, no longer weighed down by the tension of constant demands. It became what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary. The magnolia bloomed brighter that spring, its petals falling like blessings on the porch steps. I opened my windows and let the fresh air sweep through, carrying away the remnants of whispered lies and broken trust. I began to hum as I cleaned, to sing while I cooked, to smile without needing a reason. I realized that I had not only reclaimed my finances and my home, but also my spirit. Friends at church noticed the change in me. One Sunday, Sister Clara pulled me aside and said, "Evelyn, you look lighter. Like a burden's been lifted off your shoulders." I smiled and told her the truth. The burden had not been lifted, it had been put down, set aside by my own hands. I had carried what wasn't mine for far too long. Now, I carried only myself, and that was enough. Marcus stopped coming by as often. When he did, his tone was different, subdued, careful. He no longer barked orders or shoved papers under my nose. He spoke quietly, sometimes not about money at all, but about memories, how he missed the pies I used to bake, how he remembered the sound of my laughter when we watched comedies together. I did not let my guard down completely, but I allowed myself to hope that perhaps beneath Olivia's influence, my son still existed. I prayed that one day he would return not as a beggar for money, but as the boy I raised, the man he could be if he learned to value love above greed. As for Olivia, her presence faded. Perhaps she grew tired of battles she could no longer win, or perhaps she sought someone else to fund her dreams. I did not ask, and I did not care. My home was no longer hers to invade. My life was no longer hers to drain. One evening, As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in strokes of pink and gold, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and thought of the journey I had taken. I remembered the trembling fear of that first confrontation, the ache of betrayal, the sting of words meant to wound. I remembered the nights staring at receipts, the mornings walking to the credit union, the hours in Mr. Whitaker's office as he guided me toward protection, and I remembered the exact moment when I found my voice again, when I stood tall and said, "Enough." That moment was the seed, and everything since had been the bloom. At 70 years old, I discovered that it is never too late to reclaim your dignity. Never too late to protect what you built. Never too late to rise from the shadows of manipulation into the light of self. If anyone listening to my story wonders whether they are too old, too tired, too far gone to change, let me tell you this: you are not. Strength does not have an expiration date. Courage is not measured in years. And healing can come even in the final chapters of life, if only you dare to turn the page. So, my dear listener, if my story touched you, if it reminded you of your own battles, I invite you to walk with me beyond this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to hear my voice again, but to join a community where stories like mine and, like yours, can be shared and cherished. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you felt, what you learned, and perhaps even what you've endured. Because your story matters too. Together, we can build a circle of strength, a place where no one feels alone in their struggles, where we learn from each other and grow stronger side by side. And if you have lived through betrayal, if you have fought to reclaim your own worth, know that your testimony could be the very light someone else needs in their darkest hour. So share it with us. Share it with me. Because we are not just survivors, we are builders, dreamers, warriors of dignity. And here, in this space, your voice will always be heard.